living in a system based on dominant cultural norms and capitalism and supremacy incentivizes us to forget, right, who we are. And I would say part of our work is to really interrogate our shaping, our socialization, how we're wrapped up in these systems. Part of our work is to raise consciousness. Part of our work is to align with our values. Part of our work is the remembering and the reconnection to one another and nature.
Today's Into Healing guest is Michelle Cassandra Johnson, an activist, licensed clinical social worker, anti-racism consultant, yoga teacher, and 5-time book author. This is Into Healing, and I'm your host, Mira Kaddoura. Hi, Michelle.
Hi, Mira.
I'm so grateful that you're here with me today. Thank you for making it happen.
Thank you for making it happen and inviting me here.
So I want to get into just kind of your, who you are and what you do, just so people know a little bit more.
I love this question because the answer keeps shifting.
Changing?
Yeah. Throughout time. Who am I right now? So my name's Michelle, and my pronouns are she and her. And I'm coming to you from the ancestral land of the Catawba, the Cherokee, the Tutelo, the Saponi, the Occaneechi, and many other tribes in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And I am an activist and someone who holds healing space and space for transformation. I'm also someone who works with grief, individual and collective grief, and healing in most spaces I'm in, maybe all the spaces I'm in. I'm also someone who, over the past decade, I would say, has become more comfortable working with death and dying, and not just death of this incarnation of self, or as people are transitioning out of their bodies, but death in the sense of what we are experiencing on the planet and how we're moving through this time of, at times, what feels like hospice to me on a collective scale. So that's some of the work. I'm a writer and have written several books focused on healing and spiritual practice. And I'm a yoga teacher and spiritual teacher, and teach in a lot of yoga communities about how to radicalize our spiritual practice for the collective good. I'm also a beekeeper or bee tender, and someone who loves sitting with the honeybees and learning from them about collective healing. And I'm a daughter. My mother's name is Clara. And a caretaker for my mother.
Beautiful. Thank you. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey into healing and how that's unfolded?
Yeah, it feels like the same as it keeps changing and shifting, or my understanding of my journey as I think about healing. And what is coming to me in this moment is my birth story, which I won't get into all of the details because there are many, but what I was told is that I was losing oxygen and they had to do an emergency C-section. And my mother had already lost a child, so she'd had a stillbirth before me, so I can't imagine what she was experiencing in that moment when she goes into labor and they have to do this emergency C-section. And so they pull me out, and I was transported to a different hospital because there was no preemie unit in the hospital where I was born. So I was away from my mother for 9 days, and I was in a hospital 30 minutes across town. And often, as I think about it now and reflect on it, I think about my nervous system and how it was forming and responding to hospital lights and loud sounds and people picking me up who were not related to me by blood. And I was 2 pounds and 3 ounces when I was born. So I also think about my will to live, and this is why it's coming to me in relationship to healing. Often I say that I think I made a choice to come in because I could have very well made a different choice given how sick I was, how small I was, and that I was 2 months early. So I think that has shaped me. I think a lot about birth stories and how they shape us. And I think that way of coming in really shaped me and influenced me to think about survival, which feels connected to healing as well. So that's the beginning of my healing journey. And it's such an interesting question because I feel like I'm in process, as we all are, and healing along the way. And I'd say growing up and during my teenage years and college years and even graduate school, I went to grad school for social work right after college, that I went through several different experiences that called for healing, crisis experiences that called for healing. And I think I was sort of reaching for and searching for healing, but really didn't know how to access it or to remember that 2 pound, 3 ounce energy of you survived. How can you survive through this? I think more consciously I came into healing when I went to graduate school for social work and, of course, was being trained about different healing modalities and therapy and treatment and different interventions. So in this formal way, was trained about healing. And after graduate school, I started working with many different people, young people, people who were grieving, people who had eating disorders, people who wanted to work through and understand racial identity. And so I learned more about healing through that process, I would say, of witnessing and supporting others. And I think at a certain point in my private practice as a therapist, I really thought about, what does it mean to prioritize my own healing? If I'm going to position myself as someone who holds healing space, what does that actually mean? And that meant many different things. I mean, that's how I, in some ways, found the path of yoga and spiritual practice and really learned that we need a practice. If we're alive right now, we need a practice to survive these times and to cultivate and generate and promote healing. That came to me then. And of course, I had different therapists too who were supportive and provided healing spaces for me. And then I think the main crisis that feels fresh and alive for me because it continues to be activated is after George Zimmerman was acquitted for the murder of Trayvon Martin. I had been a therapist for a long time. I'd been Black for as long as I'd been alive in this incarnation of self. I'd been a racial equity educator and trainer for many, many years. And in that moment, I'd been out to dinner. I came home. I saw the news. I fell to the floor. And I remember witnessing myself in pieces on the floor, wondering, will I be pieced together again? What does this mean? I'm cracking open in a way that I don't understand. And so that feels like this pivotal moment where I felt like I was moving through ancestral trauma, I would say, and trauma that felt bigger, brokenness that felt bigger than me. And so it was confusing and scary because I didn't know what was happening and because it felt more expansive than what my body could hold. It feels like a moment I will never forget. And I remember I was married at the time, and my then partner didn't know what to do. What does one do when someone they love is falling apart in pieces on the floor, and I couldn't articulate what was happening to me, and so he was completely overwhelmed, didn't know what to do, and went to bed. I think his nervous system was overwhelmed, and it left me in this place of okay, here I am alone in some ways on the floor, worried and scared and not sure what's happening. That feels like felt like a different level of crisis and a different sort of opportunity for healing. Although at the time I didn't really know what that would look like, right? Recovery would look like is what I'll say about it. And after that happened, I experienced PTSD and racial trauma in a way that I had not before or been conscious of before. And so it meant that I was afraid to leave the house, or every time I saw a police car, I was afraid as I encountered a police car, or I was having these thoughts that I don't think are irrational given the state and what is going on in history and what continues to happen now. but they felt invasive, the thoughts I was having. And so I found a therapist, a Black woman in North Carolina, who I didn't have to explain. Like, I just called and said, I don't know what's happening to me. And she knew what was happening to me. And so through that relationship, she opened up this pathway to healing that felt somewhat shamanic in the sense of working in different realms to create harmony and healing. That's how I think about shamanism. Although I didn't know what it was at the time. But and she really deepened my connection to ancestors and my work with ancestors. And she broadened my perspective, I would say, on healing. And she also enlightened me about communal healing and healing in relationship to beings and energetic forms and ancestors that may be known to me and unknown. So I'd say that experience with her was a huge part of my healing journey and definitely influenced how I create healing spaces for people. What do we do when we're in these spaces where we don't know if we'll recover, right, is a question that I ask a lot and sit with. And who are we in relationship with that we may not be able to touch and see that can support us and may have answers. And the way that relates to that moment on the floor when I was falling apart is how I understand that moment now is that there was an ancestral assignment. So there was the grief and the crises that felt bigger than my body. And there was the assignment in that moment of how do you recover from deep ancestral wounds, some of which you understand and some of which you do not. And I feel like it led me to this place of holding space for myself and others that feels deeply transformative and connected to that shamanic journey the therapist sent me on of communing with many different forms and helpers to support us as we traverse uncertainty and as we aren't sure if we're going to be able to piece ourselves back together. So that's a little about the journey. I mean, I'm still in it and in process, although I don't feel like I'm in the same place. I mean, every time there is a racial trauma that is experienced on a collective scale, it's activated again, but I don't respond in the same way. I'm not judging my response in that moment. I don't respond in the same way, though, in the sense of I think my spiritual practice is much deeper and holds me in a way that just wasn't available in that moment when I was on the floor in pieces.
How do we reject dominant culture when it's the only system that we've ever known, either consciously or unconsciously?
I don't believe, if I think about on a spiritual scale, and I'll be clear about spirit because it feels important. I think our spiritual crisis is based on us believing we are separate from one another and separate from nature. And so when I say on a spiritual level, I'm talking about from this place of we've forgotten who we are to each other. We've forgotten who we belong to and that we belong to each other. And this earth, nature, right? We get to be on, right? How lucky are we? So,
like when we hurt the earth, we're actually hurting ourselves.
We are, and it's a reflection. Yes. And so I just want to be clear about that because I think on a spiritual level, if that's my understanding of spiritual and spirit and nature and earth-based and things that I cannot see, right, but are there and supporting me in some way or being impacted by my actions, I don't think anyone's benefiting from dominant culture. I think in many ways we are dying because of dominant culture. And I also, I don't believe this has always been. That's not in a my imagination or make-believe or dress up. I feel like there were other ways of being. And I believe there was a time when we remembered we do belong to one another and nature. And that's part of what my work is based in is like dreaming our way back into that or remembering is a lot of what I talk about and what I work with in relationship with others. So I'll just begin there. I don't think this is inherent to who we are. I don't say that from a place of hope. I don't know. Sometimes I'm hopeful. But that's not necessarily where that's coming from. I just believe there were different ways. And there are many ways as well. And living in a system based on dominant cultural norms, and capitalism and supremacy incentivizes us to forget, right, who we are. And I would say part of our work is to really interrogate our shaping, our socialization, how we're wrapped up in these systems. Part of our work is to raise consciousness. Part of our work is to align with our values. Part of our work is the remembering and the reconnection to one another and nature. And part of our work is actively disrupting and dismantling these systems. I don't believe these systems are more powerful than we are as a collective. And they want us to believe, these systems, that they are more powerful than we are as a collective. And I just choose to believe that is false. Again, not from a bypassing or transcendent place. I'm very much on earth. And here and really clear about my dharma and duty and practice and work in the world. And remembering that, these systems are designed to constrain us and make us forget and make us, unable to dream, right, helps me break through those constraints that these systems create for us. So I do think there needs to be this active process of interrogation around how have I been shaped? What have I been taught to believe? Who's benefiting from my shaping and socialization? Is what I have learned actually in the spirit of being liberated, not just myself, but the collective, right? Collective liberation and healing. I do think that's an important part of it. And then combining action with what comes from surfacing and centering those questions and going through that interrogation process of, what is it that I believe? And am I aligned? And all of the ways that a capitalist structure actually makes us be misaligned, right? Makes us be extractive, makes us forget to be relational with one another. So that's a little about dominant systems and cultural beliefs. They're not my beliefs. They're just beliefs that have been taught to me. And I have to be really clear almost every minute of every day about how that teaching is happening so I can engage in unlearning.
So what are some actions that people can take to start to, obviously the questioning is a huge part of it, but what are some actions that people can start taking to kind of inch closer to creating a new system that's based on liberation, justice, dignity, self-determination?
I think people are doing it all over the world right now, and people have been. And most of the actions that I am feeling into in this moment in response to your question about actions have to do with community and being in relationship with one another. So people are practicing collective care with one another. People are protesting with one another. People are chanting and singing with one another, right? People are cooking together. People are talking about how they're heartbroken. People are saying, no, this is not the way it will be. People are risking their lives, which is not a new thing, but people are putting their bodies on the line. And I think there are many ways to, place one's body on the line. So there's physically placing my body on the line and protesting in that way. And there are choices I can make about where I am buying certain things, right? Where things come from, who I'm in relationship with in my community. There are certain things I can do related to, do I distance from people I perceive who are completely different than me with their belief systems and ideologies? Sometimes I do for safety, and other times I actually can engage in conversation and relationship to try to better understand. There's also the action of assessing what privilege we have and how proximal we are to social and institutional power and what we have to risk, because everyone doesn't have the same capacity to risk the same things given our identities that we embody. So there's the learning about what is my proximity to power, and then what does that mean about the money, the positionality I can leverage or give up, right, in solidarity with people who are less proximal to power. There's raising consciousness. How can I be in a process of continual learning about what I don't know or what I thought I knew and need to unlearn? These are some of the actions. There's, politically being involved in some way. I was an elected official for 6 years, be that like as an elected official or voting or challenging our voting system. I'm not saying everyone needs to vote, because I think it's quite complex, actually. So these are some of the things I think people can do. For me, I am constantly lulled into this place of like, forget what's going on, don't pay attention, be distracted. And that's why the consciousness piece for me and the communal pieces around belonging feel so important to bring me back to who I am and what I believe and the world in which I want to live. A lot of times people talk to me about what they're doing and they're like, it's not enough. It's never enough. And sometimes they use that lack of enoughness as a justification not to do anything, right? Like, it's not going to mean anything. It's not going to change anything. And I think even the things we perceive as subtle or small can be deeply profound.
Absolutely.
If each one of us is doing something to contribute to disrupting and dismantling these systems that are based on dominance and a hierarchy of bodies and making whole groups of people feel inferior and upholding systems of oppression.
Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about community, because in the last 5 years, we've had a whole disruption of community. How did that disruption affect you, and how did you remain hopeful, and how did you go about making sure that community is still such a central part of everything you do?
So I'm thinking about this question about community and COVID-19 and this global disruption and political unrest and the many pandemics people talk about. And how I feel in this particular moment is that I came from community. So what is more true about me is being relational and not this belief that we're separate. And yet I understand a disruption happened in 2020 that felt different to me in my body, right? My bones, my cells, my tissues. It felt very different to be isolated and to be facing something I don't have a memory of experiencing before, right? In this incarnation of self. And I've thought a lot about COVID-19 and the murder of George Floyd and that moment and on the heels of, Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and many others. And the backdrop of the murder of George Floyd being COVID, when so many people were dying. And in that moment, what happened to the collective consciousness for a moment, I will say, what happened to people, I don't know if it was that we were isolated, that we were polarized, that we had to reconfigure our lives, that we didn't know if we would see each other again, that we were losing loved ones, the quietness of COVID in a way, because people were operating differently than they had before. But something happened in that moment that felt different. There was the difference of COVID, there was then the murder of George Floyd, and then the Black Lives Matter reinvigoration of that movement. Not that it went anywhere, but there was I'd say, reignition of that movement. And as I think about COVID-19, I think about how many of us did reconfigure our lives pretty quickly because of what was at stake. And so for me, there's a lesson in there about the possibility of reconfiguring in a way that centers community and healing pretty quickly. If we can do it because, our lives are at stake. Our lives are at stake, so what can we do now? There's that piece. There's also the consciousness that I have named that happened in this moment when we're in a global health pandemic, when there's this uprising happening that highlighted, I think, our polarization and separation on the heels of Trump's administration, all of that, which again, things like white supremacy were not new things, but our awareness of them may have shifted some. And I think there is from this experience of isolation, from separation, from reconfiguration, from death and loss, that there is a real, and from people practicing things like mutual aid, which is not new and was not new when COVID began, but more people came to it and more people talked about collective care, that there's some way we can harness that energy of what we learned from the experience of loss, of change, that there's some way we can harness this energy of collective care and of who we are to one another in this moment to continue to recover. And the other thing about that time is that relates to us. I'm saying us. I'm thinking about the dominant cultural narrative and myth that we can go back to normal when I don't know what that was. And things weren't normal before, and things certainly aren't now. And there's this I want to operate as if this didn't ever happen to us. And I don't know how healing happens when we bypass a global health pandemic and the amount of people who died and the political unrest and the wounds that will take decades, if not centuries, to recover from. And so much of what I do and of my writing is about, given these ruptures, how do we come into community with one another because this is what we have. It relates to this idea and belief that, I don't believe separation is not at the root of who we are. It's not inherent to who we are. It's what we learned. It's what we were told. And so a lot of my work centers around being in circle with one another physically or virtually and communing and caring for one another and doing many of the things I named about, community, cooking, singing, talking, grieving, breathing, engaging in ritual with one another, calling on our ancestors, saying we don't know what to do. I think this is the medicine that we need.
How do we foster those deeper connections so we don't feel more alone in the world?
It's funny because when I was a child, I remember doing this, and my mother tells me this. I was very young, and I would see a person in the grocery store or at the bus stop or walking down the street, and I would perceive they were alone. And so I would ask her if we could bring them home. And she would say, no, they're okay. They're waiting for the bus, Michelle. They're fine. And I wanted to make sure, are they okay? Are they alone? Why aren't we talking to each other? So from a young age, I was attuned to whatever I understood as separation, even though the person was probably just buying their groceries, right? And going about their day. I was yearning for connection and community and also wanted to make sure they were in community with one another. And I think it's that kind of, I think that's why I have this orientation of we're never not alone. We're always in community, and yet I understand the feeling of being alone or perceiving I'm lonely. I don't have anyone, right? No one cares about me. That's very human to feel. And I think part of the energy of that childlike me who wanted to bring everyone home is about seeing the person in the grocery store now and when it's appropriate, making eye contact with them and saying hello to them right? It's like I'm a human in a body moving on the planet with other humans. How can I remember my humanity and connect with them in some simple way? It's, looking around instead of my looking down at my phone, which I do all the time. And I notice people doing all of the time. I'm like, oh, I remember the time when I didn't hold this phone as my lifeline and connection. This is not community. It will not liberate me. It will not get us free. That's not happening. But maybe talking to somebody or smiling at someone might, or, nature is such a big part of my community. Feeling my feet on the earth, communing with my honeybees, going outside and being with the trees, right? And remembering they are part of this community as well. So I think there are many access points for people. It's just sometimes slowing down enough to notice how we feel disconnected, why we feel disconnected, and in some ways to challenge that because we aren't disconnected, even as I understand the feeling of disconnection. I've felt it in my life at different times. It's not true though. I don't move in the world now and feel lonely. Like my ancestors are always with me. I'm aware of this. What has always been is always with me and inside me. Right? What is happening now? What will happen? So this is a lot of how I think about community and in our daily lives, the small things we can do to really feel into ourselves. And even the breath, I think about this a lot too. Like my breath is a continuation of the breath that came before me. That's a way of being in community. I come from someplace. I come from people. I come from nature, remembering that as well. These are, mindfulness practices, contemplative practices that we can engage to be in community or remember we are communing all of the time.
What's your vision for the world? What would that look like?
This is such a big question. I ask people this question all the time now.
No,
Such a big question. Yeah. Two things come to heart as I think about this vision. Of course, I envision a world in which, we are all liberated and have some agency around how that liberation occurs, not at the expense of anyone else, human or the more than human world. So there's that piece. I envision a world where conditions exist for safety for everyone, for joy, for ease, whatever that might look like. And the reason I'm not being specific about it is because I think it's different for different people. So I don't want to prescribe you get free this way and joy looks like this. It's more the energy of joy or the sentiment of joy and what that means, or what being liberated in my body might mean, or in my spirit might mean for people. So that's my vision. I also envision a world where war does not exist.
Me too.
I understand the hierarchy of bodies, and so I understand why in some ways we're where we are. And I envision this world where we're not fighting over resources or where, multiple genocides are not happening, right? Where we dissolve this hierarchy of bodies and the hierarchy of human to nature. And I also vision a world where we can lean into the unknown and the mystery and trust that which we cannot see or touch. For some people, that's the void. For some people, that's some other realm, the above or the below. For some people, that's spirit or God. It's different. I just think trusting in mystery, at least in my experience, has been really helpful, not as a bypass to this earthly experience, but as an understanding that something more expansive than this earthly experience is occurring. So I envision a world where we can trust that, the rational and the scientific and the metaphysical things, these ancient practices that people have practiced for a long, long time. So where we lean into that more. And I also envision a world where I'm thinking about my mother in this moment, and she was very ill in 2019 and 2020. And as I navigated the healthcare system to try to care for her, I was witnessing what I had taught people about for many, many years around systemic racism within the healthcare system. And part of this liberated world feels like a world in which everyone has what they need to be well. And where we're humanized, because part of what I witnessed is how dehumanized the people caring for her felt, and then how in turn they dehumanized her. And that experience of like, oh, I understand what's happening because I can talk about systems and I can teach about systems. It went into my body in quite a different way, watching the lack of care people had for one another because they weren't being cared for. So I definitely envision a world where we have what we need to be well and not just our basic needs met. I feel like that's based on scarcity in a lot of ways, and we know there's enough.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we have enough food to feed the whole planet, but there's people that are starving right now.
Right now, right outside of this room, right? And so, yeah. And I also envision a world where, I mentioned joy, where there's a lot of laughter. Yeah.
Me too.
Yeah.
Joy, that's been a big one for me. How do we bring more joy into our lives, Because I think these systems of domination, control, oppression try to take the joy, try to,
steal the joy or sell us something so we can feel what we think is joyful, which is not actually true
at all. Yeah. How do we repair or rebuild connection with our lineage when it's been stripped away by a million different ways?
People ask me questions about ancestors and lineage all of the time. And part of it is because I write about ancestors, talk about ancestors a lot. I reference my grandmother, Dorothy, who transitioned in 2017. And she is the ancestor who is with me all of the time. And I'm present to her. I can feel her around me.
I feel the same way about my
Your grandmother
too.
Yeah. So people are, I think, curious about lineage, specifically because of what you named around rupture. Some of us do not know where we're from, our blood lineage, or we can only trace back to a certain point. That's true for me. Some of us, I would say many of us, have complex relationships with our ancestors, maybe because of the not knowing, but also of what we understand they did. Because of the hierarchy of bodies and systems of oppression and how they enacted oppression. And I think it's also complicated because, families have secrets. And so often, I haven't met a family who has not had a secret. And so I think there can be a lack of storytelling about what actually happened. And so there's this way people are trying to piece together who they are through stories that may not be full stories, right? And really, I think people are, this idea and this experience of lineage, people are trying to understand who they are in the here and now, right? How to make sense. And so some of the practices that are based in healing the ruptures and also understanding more about where we come from, some of the practices I suggest are, one thing to know is I believe that in everyone's lineage, there are healthy and well ancestors somewhere. And if they're not in our blood lineage, then they're in different streams, wisdom streams. So a spiritual lineage, nature, right? This living ancestor around us, different teachers or teachings, in the elements, fire, air, earth, water, the above and below. These are all parts of our lineage as well. If it feels inaccessible to dip our toe into or our full body into the water, as we think about ancestors, then often I invite people to connect with the more than human world initially, and to trust there are healthy and well ancestors waiting to support you. And given this belief I have, I invite people to ask for their healthy and well ancestors to show up in some way. And I say, they might show up in a dream. They might show up in a vision. They might show up through some symbol. You might overhear someone say something and it's for you, and it's actually this ancestor responding to you in some way. And I find that once people open to that, this is a mystery, what we cannot see or touch. So it's like trusting something's there, and often there can be a lot of fear around that. Once people open that channel, well, that's already open. But once they invite their ancestors to connect with them, most people I work with have had some response through a symbol, through a sign, through a dream, right? Through a vision, through an affirmation. So that's one way. Ask for your healthy and well ancestors to support you. And then wait and be open to their support. The other thing I suggest to people is ask questions. If there are still people who are alive in your lineage, ask questions. I don't mean do this in some reckless way, right? We need boundaries, and people know their circumstances better than I. And I do suggest, ask your grandmother if they're still here, or that distant aunt, right? Check in and see what they know and what they can share with you, so you can better understand who you are and who is available to support you. I also invite people to notice what they're drawn to. So the foods they like to eat, the music they like to listen to, different gestures or practices they're called to. Often there's a connection to lineage through that. Like, why am I moving in this particular way? Oh, my great-grandmother did this. Or why am I saying this thing? Oh, my great-uncle did this. That's there, that information. And so I think being curious and inquiring in that way feels important.
I feel that way with food. Why am I attracted to these certain foods? There's something very ancestral and deep kind of wisdom of why I love dates, for example.
Yes,
right?
That makes a lot of sense, right?
Or olives or pomegranates. There's certain foods that definitely have a deep, deep wisdom within them. There's a question that you were really curious about when you were a teenager, which is, where do I come from? Have you been able to gain answers to this question, and how has that healed you?
It actually may have started well before that with my birth, right? And how I came in and who was around me and making meaning of that. And I was in school being told certain stories and narratives that I was like, this isn't true, or I can't trace my family tree. It can only go this far. And I was having that experience. I also was having the experience in the educational system of, being lied to about many, many different groups of people and where we come from as a collective. And it's such an important question and central to my work to ask myself and others, where are we from? And what I understand about where I'm from, there are many things. A few of them are about knowing at this point in my life that, yes, I come from my blood lineage. So I come from my mother and father and grandparents and great-grandparents and everything that happened before that, my great-grandmother, Angie. Right? I come from them. I also believe I come from that mystery I believe I come from nature and the earth as well. And a teacher, an experience I had that really, I would say, gave me a different understanding of where I'm from is someone asked me about my people. And I started to talk about them the way I'm talking about them now, right? Blood lineage. And I started to talk about my great-grandmother, Angie. And I said, Angie her parents were slaves, and she was born into slavery. And I don't know much about her. And she had dementia when I was very young, so we didn't get to talk in a way that I understood in this reality. Although I think she was sharing things, I didn't understand them. And the person who I shared this with said, you described your mother and your father, your grandmother and your grandfather, and you said like who they were. And when you got to your great-grandmother, you said, you named the conditions that were in place. She had dementia. She was born into slavery. Her parents were slaves. When there was so much more to her. And when this person said this to me, I was, I don't even know the word. I was drinking rose tea and I almost spilled it on the floor. That was my response of like, whoa, I'm describing a human as the conditions that were in place rather than the vibrancy of this human. And so there was a deepening of where I'm from in response to that understanding of I am not the conditions that are in place. We are not the conditions that are in place. We are much more than that. So I think that added a layer of healing that had not been present before, just in response to understanding how much we are defining where we're from based on the conditions in place. Coupled with what I said about remembering I'm nature, I'm from the earth, we all come from the same place, even as we are moving through the world differently. And so I think through the asking of the question of where we're from and through my constant exploration of where I'm from and being in conversation with others about where they're from, that healing happens all of the time, right, in response to this practice of being with this question of where am I from, where are we from? Because it calls us into who do we want to be, really.
Well, I was just thinking about how even as I watch part of my lineage and part of where I'm from, like, be literally mass murdered, I'm like, I refuse to be a victim. You know, I'm an expansive being and I refuse to take on that identity, you know?
Right.
It's like a way of resisting that oppression.
It sounds like a reclamation process in that way. What you described, like your refusal, what you named, I will not be a victim. And I'm more expansive than this. I think I'm generalizing.
We forget.
We forget.
Yeah, we forget that we're these expansive beings, you know? And sometimes it's easy to just see the conditions, right? It's just, yeah.
That reminds me of one of my favorite, I mentioned I'm a yoga practitioner and spiritual teacher, and one of my favorite teachings from the Bhagavad Gita, which for those who may not be familiar is a sacred text about many things, which I could talk about forever. The one thing I'm going to talk about now is there's a teaching in there where Krishna, the guide, is teaching Arjuna, the warrior, about being a spiritual being. And Krishna says to Arjuna, who's grief-stricken and doesn't want to fight and is having an internal war, and there's this external war happening, and Arjuna is being equipped with some practices and tools to live into his dharma. And what Krishna says is, you are an earthly being and a spiritual being, so more expansive than this earthly experience. And if you believe yourself to, just be an earthly being and become wedded to your earthly experience, you will forget you're a spiritual being and suffering will occur. And if you believe you can transcend your earthly experience because you are a spiritual being and you can evade your dharma and your duty, you will experience suffering. And I love this teaching because there's this call, at least in how I understand it, for us to remember both, right? I remember I'm a spiritual being so I can more fully live into my earthly assignment. And I remember I'm an earthly being breathing in this body so that I can be clear about what it is I'm supposed to do on this earth here and now so that I can be liberated when I leave this body. And so I just love this. I love it, but I also think it's like essential that we remember we are bigger than our bodies. Even if one does not believe they are a spiritual being, they are something in addition to the physical human experience they are having. And for me, that has given me courage in moments when I've been completely afraid to respond, to take action, to speak up, to put my body on the line in some way, to take a risk. Like remembering both earth and spirit has helped me do what I need to do. It's helped me get out of the way, and like my mind out of the way, so I can do what I need to do, what's called for. Not in a savior way. I don't mean that. I mean in a conscious, intentional way. So any opportunity to talk about the Bhagavad Gita, and Michelle will take it.
Let's talk about spirit a little bit more. So how do we become connected to spirit?
I first learned about spirit, or God as my grandmother would call spirit, in the church from watching her and watching how devoted she was. And the other thing my grandmother taught me about spirit, which I witnessed as a child, is, every time I was at her house, when I spent the night and was there in the morning, she would read the daily devotional, she would pray, and she would have a cup of black coffee. And at first, I really didn't know what she was doing. I was very young when I watched her do this. And I have a deep understanding of it now around that was her moment to consciously connect to spirit, to God, to prepare herself for her day. It's similar to the ritual I have now of praying. I light a beeswax candle, I pray, I meditate, I pull a divination card, I write gratitude statements, I might do something else. It's my way, right? And it's very similar to what she did. So I learned something about devotion and practice from her and spirit, and this connection she had with the divine that could not be severed. And so I think people can connect with spirit by remembering they're a spiritual being, however they understand spirit. Right? What do you understand that exists beyond your body? What do you understand that might be holding you in some way? What does faith look like for you? Or trust if faith is not accessible? Most people have some understanding of something beyond themselves. There just may be fear about it, right? It's not math. It's not 2 + 2 = 4. It's not that, and that can be very just scary terrain. I will acknowledge that. That can cause a lot of anxiety, and I think there's a lot of freedom that can happen when we remember. How do I experience spirit when I look at a river, or when I touch a tree, or when a butterfly flies past me, or for me when I sit with my honeybees, right? When I'm with other beings, how does spirit show up? And then how does that mirror how spirit resides within me? Is something people can do. Nature is a great teacher in general, and a great teacher for reconnection to spirit. The other thing I'm doing more of today, which is interesting to me, is I've chanted for a long time, but I'm singing more with groups. I'm not a singer. And I'm singing with groups and inviting them to connect to their voice and vibration more, which I think is such a profound way to connect to spirit.
Yeah.
Through like the eternal vibration that exists within us all for all of time. Right? Song can do that. Words can be limiting, right? Conversation and beautiful. And singing, though, can be, I find that I can tap into something different because I'm accessing, right, this creativity and my heart and combining that with my throat and doing that in front of people and with people.
Being witnessed.
Right? And it's such a...
Powerful.
It is. So I'm loving this new way to invite spirit in.
I love that. Singing and chanting and humming has definitely come up in these conversations, which I love. It's definitely been a practice I've been leaning more into as well. So there's a theme that you go back to again and again in your books, which is grief. What exactly is grief?
Often I describe it as water, which water is connected to grief, right? Through this experience of tears that people can relate to and salt that people can relate to. And I also describe it as water because in the ocean, because in my experience, there are waves of grief. So I'm, there are different levels of intensity at different times. And I think grief it's something everyone will experience in many ways. And we don't all experience it in the same way. It depends. And I also think about grief as a teacher and as a friend. I've learned a lot from grief, particularly in its relationship to love and liberation. And I've learned a lot about what happens when grief stagnates in the body, not just the physical body, but emotionally, mentally, spiritually, what happens to us when we do not process our grief. And so I kind of think about it like this cup of tea. Like it's something I want to like cozy up with because it's such a teacher and so much a part of our human experience. Not the only part, there's joy. And I think I'm drawn to it because sometimes I'm drawn to things that people want to look away from. I would say that as a theme in my life and work and practice and being. And so I'm drawn to it because there can be such resistance to it. And it made me curious once I noticed that. Why are we afraid of grief and loss when we will lose everything we have ever known?
Yeah, why do you think we're afraid of it?
Well, loss can be traumatic. I think there's that. And ultimately, I think we're afraid of dying and we're afraid of death. So not just our physical death, but any change or transition or uncertainty. And grief, if it brings you anything, in my experience, it brought a lot of uncertainty and a lot of, I planned this for today, but I'm in the bed in tears, right? Like this is what's happening instead. Or I'm in the middle of a conversation and I have a memory that is tied to a loss and then I'm in tears or I'm angry, right? Or I'm laughing hysterically. All of these things, it's like, I feel like it calls on the body and the emotional self and it pulls in a way that it just hasn't matched other experiences. So I think like we want to be contained and in control. So of course we would be afraid of something that makes us feel out of control. And grief, that broken apart place I was in on the floor after the acquittal of George Zimmerman, right? There was no containment. It wasn't even possible to contain what was happening in that moment. I think we're afraid of that. In my experience, humans like to calculate and strategize and do the math, right? Instead of being the waves, not knowing how to surf, right? Like, I will lose everything I know and have. That I know. So how do I respond to that truth and grieve that loss every day?
So speak to me about grief and how it gets you closer to love and liberation, and also what happens when we don't process our grief?
Several years ago, actually it was before COVID, before I was aware of COVID, I will say, I planned this summit called Healing and Community. That was a group of, it was like 20 online interviews, or it started as 14 online interviews with people. And then COVID happened and I was like, oh, I need to do more now that this is what we're talking about. And the theme was healing and community. And it was grief and liberation and the link between the two. And it really came from the ancestors. It was an assignment, again, an ancestral assignment to like do this thing. And I wasn't sure why we would need to grieve together and what was going on. And of course, then COVID happened and many other things happened and many other ruptures. And the link that I was aware of between grief and liberation and that others illuminated through these interviews was about the freedom that can happen for us physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, individually, and collectively when we actually acknowledge what we've lost. When we make space through ritual and practice in Circle to Grieve. That there's no way for us to get free unless we acknowledge what we've lost or what we're risking, right? What's at stake. And so I understand the two are inextricably bound. Grief, love, grief, liberation, that they're connected because of what I named about this this resistance to acknowledging loss. And when we don't acknowledge loss, we continue to be caught up in these systems with these dominant cultural norms, and we don't disrupt them. And I actually think making space to grieve is a disruption to dominant culture and is an antidote to dominant culture. So there's that piece of like how we become liberated through the process of grieving, and through what we learn about through our process of grieving, I believe will lead us to these maybe old ways of being, right? Or this process of remembering. And this practice of truth instead of denial, I think, is part of it. Also, so many people have talked about the link between grief and love, and that grief is an expression of how much we loved whatever it is we've lost, whomever we've lost. And I think this is true. At least it's been my experience, so that grief is an expression of love. That's how I think about the link between those two. And so if we love humanity enough, right, if we make space to grieve what is happening to humans, to our planet, to the more than human world, and we grieve, right, acknowledge and grieve and account for, then how big can our love be, right? I think there's possibility in that as well, which is why there's like there are the personal reasons in my own, losses I've experienced. And for me, there's much more of what I'm tapped into is the collective experience that we have almost every minute of every day of loss or, anticipating loss, because polarization and strife and trauma are happening all around us and to us and to the planet. So I think there's ample opportunity for us to grieve and to express love through our grief and to make different choices so we do not create more loss. And can mitigate some of the suffering we experience. So there's that piece.
What happens when we don't process our grief?
Disease and dis-ease. People experience physical ailments because they have unprocessed trauma and grief and ancestral trauma in their bodies and DNA and bones and on every level. So I think death happens. I think disconnection happens when we don't process our grief, isolation, the things that are opposite of being in community. I think violence happens.
Big time.
Dehumanization. extraction, exploitation. There's also this is an image really coming to me, but it's, it's connected to the way many of us may have been conditioned to hide our grief or grieve alone, right? Don't show your emotions. Like my mother would be like, you can cry and then you need to stop crying, right? You can express the tears and then get over it because we have things to do, which I understand and I love her dearly and I do not judge her for that. That was from her conditioning and what she had to do. So she was just training me to do the same. And I was always like, but what if I want to cry more, right? Shouldn't we all be crying about what's going on? I mean, I'm laughing right now, but I often ask that, like, can we all just cry about this situation? I know the tears are right there, right? They're on the surface. Let them come up. And then we release them. They're not within us anymore. They're not contained. So I think there's such encouragement for us not to grieve, or to grieve in isolation, to contain it in that way I was talking about, like we're trained to contain things. When everything is like out of control right now, right? So let's get rid of that myth that we can contain this and be in the mess of it. And grieving is part of the mess of it and healing from it.
I'd almost say that healing can't happen if we don't grieve.
Yeah.
I think it comes out sideways when it's bottled and it stays in there. And that's, I mean, you said it, like the violence comes out and the harm comes out because there wasn't room to grieve.
Right.
When the traumas in life happens. So then you just bottle it up and then the harm is inflicted on others because there's unprocessed grief or anger or whatever emotion.
We don't all have the same access to healing.
Nope.
And so, yes, I think we need to grieve. And I'm aware I have money to go to therapy if I want to go. I can go get a massage tomorrow, probably this afternoon if I found a place here, right? Like I can go eat nourishing food that is healthy for my body in some way. I could call a friend. I could call my mother. I could go outside in the woods, which would be deeply healing for me in a place I can grieve in all the time. I love nature, as I've spoken to. So I want to uplift that I'm aware we don't all have the same access, and that's on purpose. And yet, somewhere in our lineage, there are rituals that we have that are focused on grief and loss and celebration and abundance and joy. And sometimes we have to do work to get to those. And I may have more ease around accessing that because of my privilege. So I want to honor that. I don't think we can heal if we do not make space to grieve. And I also know some of us, like my mom was like, get over it, because she was a single parent taking care of 2 children with my father, who they were divorced, didn't pay child support, and she was a special education teacher. So like she was too stressed to grieve.
Yeah.
She had many things to grieve, and she was like, there's no time.
Yeah, and sometimes the circumstances also don't make room to grieve. I mean, especially if you're still being traumatized.
Right.
You're just in survival mode. There's no room for grief or any other emotion for that matter.
Right. Yeah, it feels important to name that, especially as someone who holds healing space, because healing, it's not one size fits all, and it's not linear. And we need different things to be able to heal. And so part of what, I feel like I can do with the privilege I have is, and the access and the information I have is, continue to illuminate that truth of we don't all have the same access, and increase conditions for folks to have what they need in general and to heal, right? What do we need to be able to heal?
What do you think is the difference between private grief and collective grief?
Private grief is my mother crying in her room when she thought we could not hear her at night. She'd do it late at night. Or closing the door, or grabbing the tissue right away for someone when they're in tears instead of letting them flow, right? There's a thing that happens in the nervous system when someone hands me a tissue and I didn't ask for one. And I actually just want the tears to come because I need the release to happen. Or it'll be okay. Or you wouldn't be given more than you can handle. Like these all feel tied to this private grief. And collective grief feels like, well, ritual to me. And it feels like circle. It feels like song, singing. It feels like silence. It feels like fire right in the middle of the circle. It feels like listening, deep listening, and seeing one another. It feels like the capacity of the circle to hold the uncertainty and the not knowing. It feels like laughter as well. It feels like saying what needs to be said and being witnessed. That's a big difference in collective grief and private grief is no one was, I mean, I heard my mom, so I was witnessing in that way, but I didn't know how to, she didn't want us to know she was crying. So then if I asked her about it, are you sad? Yeah. Are you, no time to talk about that with her child, right? Whereas in circle, whatever that might be for people, there is a witnessing and acknowledgement. You're here and you're grieving, or your heart is broken, or your heart is open enough to feel into what is unfolding. And there's grief attached to that. And healing is connected to collective grief, a process of that.
Is there things that you can think of which could make this process a little gentler, maybe?
If we accept suffering as part of our experience and loss as part of our experience, perhaps we will feel more gentleness and ease if we accept what is. So to be in this human body means that for me, I have a pretty open heart, and often I say I have a broken heart most of the time, if not all of the time, that I'm aware of. That there are a number of things that if I sit and feel into my body, if I go on social media, if I turn on the news, if I read the paper, if I talk to a friend, there are so many things to be brokenhearted about or feel brokenhearted about. And I actually think it's that tenderness and brokenheartedness. It feels like such a gift, is what I'll say. And so I wonder if people accessing that part of themselves with the resources they need to grieve and continuing to be available to have a broken heart will actually bring us back into wholeness. Maybe we'll suffer less if we acknowledge our brokenheartedness more.
I love that. So if grief is so universal and something that is just part of the human condition that we'll all go through, is there something we can do to grieve well?
I feel like we can acknowledge what we're losing to one another, that we can say, I'm worried about this. I'm anxious about the world. I don't know what's going to happen. I'm scared. I don't know what to do. I'm overwhelmed. I'm heavy. Often I feel grief in my body first, like energetic heaviness. That feels, it's like hard to move is often how it manifests for me. So I'm heavy. When are we going to remember who we are to one another, right? That we can say these things, which feels like an action and counter to what we may have been trained to do, which we may have been trained to grieve in private and not actually speak what we're present to. And I mean, I imagine there are people who are like on the planet right now not feeling things. I don't know. Like, I don't know how one could be alive and not feel something I just said. What I do know is I'm in community and relationship with many people who are saying, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to say for some things that are happening across the world. Michelle, I don't know what to do. Or what I'm doing is not changing what is happening. And that's a whole other level of grief. Like, that's just feeling ineffective, although I'm not hopeless, to make change when lots of people are doing things to disrupt the multiple genocides, the traumas, and it's that not enoughness. Although I don't often feel that in myself. It's just and then I'm watching it on my phone happen. And so I think we can say these things. I think that's part of grieving well, is being honest about what is present.
Mm-hmm. What do we find on the other side when we grieve well?
You know, I don't know, other than resonance, which feels connected to humanness.
Connectedness.
Right. Interconnectedness. And maybe something comes from that place, some idea, some practice, some part of the strategy to disrupt what is breaking our hearts. Maybe something comes from that. It's just the recognition, like, what if everyone said, this is completely overwhelming and should not be happening? What would happen?
Mm-hmm.
Or if I asked, like the person at the grocery store that I went to earlier, how are you? How's your heart? Mine is broken. I have done this before to people, which is a little, but it's like I want to connect around what is real.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, I mean, clearly. Clearly you do.
If you could teach someone or anyone watching or listening to this a single tool for grieving, what would that tool be?
This is a great question. In one of my books, in Finding Refuge, there's a practice at the beginning where I invite people to touch into something that's happening on the planet that is affecting them in some way, and making them feel brokenhearted. And the invitation is for them to connect to their heart, to notice what arises, and to say, I feel my heart, I feel my heartbeat, I acknowledge my heart, I acknowledge my heartbeat. There are many practices in that book. That's the one that comes to me now. That book and grieving is about heart work. It's not about having a good heart. It's about doing the deep work and connecting to the heart enough to tap into brokenheartedness and to build our capacity to do that. And so that's a practice where you don't need anything except yourself and a connection to your heart. And it's a practice to, what does it feel like when I feel my heart? When I remember I have a heart, when I feel it beat, when I touch into other people have a heart, right? Like what happens? So that's a practice I would offer. Like slowing down for a minute and working with that affirmation or mantra of I feel my heart, I feel my heartbeat, I acknowledge my heart, I acknowledge my heartbeat.
Yeah, sometimes we go about our days not even recognizing that there's this thing beating that's keeping us alive.
Right. Yeah. And the heart is a portal and doorway and passageway and gateway and all the things.
Yeah.
And our connection to the past and now and the future.
And to each other and everything else. Beautiful. So you talk about bees a lot, and you actually care for bees. What do they teach you? And maybe even specifically about grieving.
There's a practice which some people may be familiar with called telling the bees. And it's a practice that is an old practice in a few different lineages where it began with the idea that if something happened to the beekeeper or someone in the beekeeper's family, that they would need to go out to the hives knock on the hive once and tell the bees of their mourning, what they're mourning, so that the bees could mourn with them. It's expanded to law, it's loss and connection, union, marriage, celebration, abundance, anything we want to tell the bees. And I've started to teach more of this with people in community telling the bees because they are psychopomps, which means they are able to work between realms. And in fact, in some mythologies, bees are said to be able to help transport souls after they've transitioned. And to help with transition and grief, of course, is connected to loss and transition. And so there is an old practice about grief and the bees, which I don't think is any mistake, that we can commune with them and tell them what is in our hearts. Or even, I go and sit with them and tell them what I'm afraid of and what's happening on the planet. And of course, sit with them and feel into how they're doing as well. So they can join in that because, based on mythology, their capacity to hold grief is greater than mine, and their capacity to understand what is unfolding greater than mine. They're part of the mystery. I can see and touch them, right? They are part of the mystery in my mind. So that's something about the bees and grief, and they have taught me the most about community. Now, there are many teachers in nature. I just happen to have a direct relationship with them. Although I think people can commune with them without having them in their yard, having an apiary. There are many ways we can touch into their hum, their vibration. You can watch videos of them do what it is that they do. There are many teachers who teach about bees. You can learn about bee mysticism as well, which I've studied in bee shamanism as well, and how they work between realms. And specifically related to community, honeybees are a superorganism, and so a single honeybee does not think of themselves as an individual. They think of themselves as an extension of the hive, which is what deeply resonates with me as I think about healing and community. Right? What if, humans are not a superorganism, and what if we could be, though? And what can we learn from the ways of the bee that can support us in embodying some of the qualities of a superorganism? That's what I would say. And one thing I love about them is they have different roles. There are the nurse bees who nurse the eggs and the larvae. They're the bees who build honeycomb. They're the bees who line the honeycomb with propolis, which is tree resin, and it's deeply protective. They're the bees who are undertakers and take out the bees who are no longer alive physically. There are the foragers as well. That's the final stage of the life cycle, is to be a forager. And what I appreciate about the roles, there are two things. One is that bees, if the hive needs something in particular, bees can revert back to a different role. So if they're a forager and they actually need more honeycomb because they have too much of something, pollen or nectar, right? They can revert back to that. If they need more bees to turn nectar into honey, they can revert back to the bees that fan the nectar to take the water out of it to turn it into honey. There's a teaching in there for us about shape-shifting enough based on the conditions in place to live into the role that is required of us at the time for the collective. There's that piece. And the other piece I love about the foragers is they're gathering resources they may not benefit from. They're gathering them for the good of the hive and the sustainability of the hive. And a bee's life cycle in most regions, at least where I live, in the spring and summer and early fall, is 6 weeks. Winter bees live a little longer because they have to get the hive through winter. And I love this idea of, and it also relates, I mentioned the Bhagavad Gita earlier, it relates back to dharma and duty and fruits of our labor, that we may not see the fruits of our labor. These bees are gathering pollen and water and nectar and may never get to eat the honey that is made from that nectar, or benefit from the pollen that is in the hive that is also food and used to feed the larva. But they collect it anyway and gather it and bring it back to the hive. And there's a teaching in that for us too.
Oh, yeah.
about for the sake of what? Like, why are we doing what we're doing? And the trust that what we're doing now will in some way positively affect the good of the hive, right? The sustainability of the hive, and not just the human hive, but the more than human world. So they are my favorite teachers. I am grateful to be able to sit next to them and hum with them and listen to them hum and watch them do what they do in the darkness of their hive when I'm able to go in, or observe in the light as I'm sitting out and watching them go into the darkness. And they do most of what they do in the dark, which I also think is a metaphor for where we are at this time. And what does it mean to like birth in the dark and dance in the dark, right? And share information about resources in the dark. So they are such beautiful creatures, and I love being in relationship with them, and feel like there's so much for us to learn. I feel like they're much wiser than humans, and there's a lot to learn from honeybees and nature in general.
Yeah. We recently put in a lot of natives, and we've gotten all these bees back, and it's just magical. Just seeing all these bees around.
Yeah, they are magical and medicinal, and yeah.
Is there anything that you feel called to share that we haven't really covered today?
I feel like something people in groups I hold ask about is hope. I'm in spaces with people who have the same questions I have, and who feel overwhelmed like I am, and who are acknowledging their heartbreak, and who are laughing and being joyful with one another, and who are protesting, and who are singing and forming circle after circle, and who are contemplating how to be in right relationship with humans and the ecosystem, and who are willing to journey to different realms shamanically, and then to come back and bring medicine. And I say this because sometimes people feel like they're the only one, or that's the only circle that exists, and I'm in circles, multiple circles a day, that do the things I just described. So there are many, many people who actually envision a world that is different than what is unfolding right now in this earthly realm, as we think about polarization and oppression and violence. And there are many people engaged in the healing. And it can be easy to forget that. And so I have a lot of evidence of that, which is likely what keeps me going and doing what I do. So I want people to know and trust that.
Yeah, I see it too.
Yeah, it's in a lot of places.
It's time.
It is. It's time.
We often ask our guests if there's a 5-minute practice that they would be called to share with us. Would that be something that you'd want to do?
Absolutely. I will invite folks listening to close their eyes or find a soft gaze. And I invite you to let your hands rest wherever feels most comfortable. I invite you to bring your awareness and attention to your breath. And as you inhale and exhale, to feel the expansion with your inhales, and the way you come back to center into yourself with your exhales. There's this expansion and openness as you breathe in, and this contraction or hugging into center as you exhale. And I invite you to deepen your breath a bit more. And to sense into the space between the expansion and the contraction, the space between the inhales and exhales. And I invite you to experience your breath as it is connected to all that has been. What is now. And the future, what will be. So to come into the knowing, the wisdom, the remembering that you are part of a continuum of community, of experience, of lineage, of legacy, of possibility, of expansion and coming back to the center of it all. And just notice how this feels, remembering we come from some place, we are here now, we are part of what is unfolding and will be in the future. We are in connection to all things, all that is and all we dream of. Take a few more deep breaths here. Knowing you can return to this practice, the breath, the continuum, the expansion, contraction, the wisdom, and your dreams anytime you need. And when you feel ready, you can bring yourself back, gently blinking open your eyes if they're closed, coming into your space. And just noticing. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle.
Yeah, good to be with you.
So grateful that
Me too.
you came and spent time with me.
Thanks for inviting me to be here and doing this work and practice.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please like, subscribe, and share with a friend. You can connect with Into Healing on TikTok and Instagram for more inspirational and behind-the-scenes content, and visit our website, intohealing.com, for transcripts and other goodies. Thank you for joining us.